The courtroom was supposed to be a place of order, a space where voices were restrained, where emotions were trimmed into the rigid framework of law. But that morning, the air was thick with tension that no gavel could tame. On one side of the aisle sat Eleanor, the millionaire's young pregnant wife, her hands trembling slightly as they rested against the swell of her belly. She had walked into this room knowing she would face whispers, judgmental glances, and the cold, sharp presence of her husband's mistress seated only a few steps away. What she did not expect was the violence that came without warning. As testimony was being exchanged, the mistress, draped in designer arrogance and false confidence, rose from her chair with a venomous hiss of words Eleanor could barely process before the sting of a palm cracked across her cheek. The sound echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. Gasps filled the air, reporters leapt half out of their seats, pens stalling mid-scratch. Eleanor staggered back, one hand flying to shield both her face and the child she carried, eyes wide with disbelief. The bailiff froze, uncertain whether to intervene as the judge's gavel thundered against wood in a futile attempt to restore order. But the silence that followed was unlike any silence that had come before. It was thick, heavy, the kind of silence that carries the weight of an oncoming storm. Every gaze turned toward the bench, expecting fury, expecting the judge to scold, perhaps to order the mistress held in contempt. Yet the judge did not immediately speak. He stared at the young woman, at the reddening mark across her cheek, and his expression was not merely judicial, it was personal, as though beneath the robe and the stern mask of law there was something far deeper rising. The mistress smirked, certain her beauty and the millionaire's wealth would shield her from consequence. She had no idea that the man presiding over this case carried a secret of blood and loyalty that was about to explode into the open. The gavel slammed again, this time not to call for order, but to strike the first note of revelation. The mistress adjusted her skirt with smug composure, as if the echo of her slap had already declared her the victor in this twisted spectacle. The millionaire, seated between his attorney and the trembling hands of his ego, leaned back in his chair with a smirk of his own, convinced that money would soon drown the scandal. But the judge's silence lingered too long, his hand frozen around the gavel, his eyes fixed not on the mistress, not even on the husband, but on Eleanor. There was no mistaking the way his jaw tightened, no denying the flicker of anguish that cut through the granite of his expression. Slowly, he rose from the bench, every inch of his movement defying courtroom tradition, the black robe flowing like a storm cloud around him. The courtroom watched in stunned disbelief. Judges did not rise for litigants, they did not step down from their thrones of authority. Yet this one did. His voice broke the stillness, low but steady, carrying not just authority but a dangerous, personal edge. That woman you just struck, is my daughter. Gasps erupted, some sharp as gunfire, others choked with disbelief. The mistress's face drained of color, her smirk evaporating as though burned away by the revelation. The millionaire blinked, his smugness faltering, eyes darting from his wife to the bench as the ground beneath his arrogance began to shift. Reporters scrambled for pens and cameras, the room alive with chaos, but the judge's presence silenced all within moments. He stood no longer as a distant arbiter of law but as a father whose patience had shattered. I have tolerated your arrogance, he said, his voice rising now, aimed at both the mistress and the man who had betrayed his daughter. I have tolerated your disrespect for this court, for truth, for decency. But I will not, under any law, under any roof, tolerate harm against my child, or my grandchild. His words rang through the chamber like a verdict carved in stone, unshakable, final. Eleanor's lips trembled, her eyes filling with tears she had fought hard to hold back. For the first time since the scandal erupted, she was no longer alone in that courtroom. She had not just a judge, but her father, her protector, standing against the venom that had sought to break her. For a fleeting moment, the mistress tried to compose herself, blinking rapidly as though she could erase the slap she had delivered and the revelation that had followed. But no performance, no practiced pout or wide-eyed innocence, could mask the trembling in her hands. She opened her mouth to speak, to weave some excuse or appeal to charm, but the words caught in her throat under the weight of the judge's piercing glare. The millionaire shifted uncomfortably, his lawyer whispering urgently in his ear, but his confidence, once inflated like a balloon, now sagged under the pinprick of truth. Your Honor, the mistress finally stammered, her voice brittle as glass. I didn't know. The judge cut her off, his voice booming through the chamber, stripping away every excuse. You knew she was a wife. You knew she was with child. That knowledge was enough. My relation to her does not lessen your crime, it magnifies it. He turned his gaze toward the millionaire, whose smirk had crumbled entirely, leaving only the pale mask of a man who realized too late the empire he thought untouchable had begun to collapse. "And you," the judge thundered, "thought your wealth would shield you. Thought your mistress could spit on my daughter and walk free under the shade of your money. But hear me now. There is no wealth, no title, no power in this land that outweighs justice, nor the wrath of a father whose blood has been spilled by betrayal." The courtroom murmured, the sound like a rising tide of outrage mixed with awe. Some leaned forward, eager to see the mighty humbled. Reporters scribbled furiously, knowing headlines were writing themselves in real time. Eleanor sat frozen, her hand pressed protectively to her stomach, tears spilling freely as years of silence and suffering seemed to unravel in a single moment. For once, she felt the world tilt in her favor, not because of lawyers or money, but because her father, her protector, stood between her and the wolves. The judge pounded the gavel once more, but this time it was not a call to order. It was the sound of finality, the prelude to justice. "Bailiff," he commanded, his voice steady and lethal, "place her under arrest for contempt and assault. And prepare to hear charges that will strip this man of every illusion of control he ever thought he had." The mistress's face drained of color as the bailiff stepped forward, his heavy boots echoing against the polished marble floor. She tried to back away, clutching at the millionaire's arm in desperation, but he recoiled, shaking her off like a burden he had never truly cared for. "Don't let them take me," she cried, her voice rising to a shrill pitch that bounced against the walls and made the jury flinch. But no hand came to her rescue, no sympathetic face rose in her defense. The cameras flashed mercilessly, capturing every frame of her downfall, her once practiced elegance now shattered into something pitiful and raw. The bailiff's hand closed firmly around her wrist, his voice calm yet unyielding, "Ma'am, you are under arrest." Her protests dissolved into incoherent pleas as she was pulled toward the exit, her designer heels scraping against the floor, leaving behind only the acrid scent of desperation and defeat. The judge watched with a grim resolve, his face betraying no emotion except the faint twitch of a clenched jaw. His gavel still rested in his hand, as though ready to strike again if necessary, but the silence of the courtroom proved his authority needed no reinforcement. Attention then shifted to the millionaire, who sat slumped in his chair like a man waiting for his sentence even before it had been spoken. His lawyer whispered frantically, trying to salvage dignity from ashes, but the judge leaned forward, his voice carrying the heavy gravity of both paternal fury and judicial authority. "Mr. Harrington," he intoned slowly, each syllable cutting like a blade, "you believed yourself untouchable, hiding your sins behind the veil of fortune. You humiliated my daughter, endangered my grandchild, and now you stand exposed before the very people you mocked with your arrogance." The millionaire swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly, as sweat formed at his temple. The judge's words were not just a father's anger, they were the pronouncement of a man who had the full weight of law and truth behind him. "Today, this court will begin stripping away every lie, every shield, every coin that has bought your silence and your audacity. You will answer for every cruelty." The audience sat spellbound, breaths held as though they too awaited judgment. And in that suspended moment, Eleanor, still trembling, finally lifted her chin. For the first time in years, she felt the shackles of fear loosen around her heart. Justice was no longer a dream, it had a voice, a gavel, and it was her father's. The millionaire straightened suddenly, as though some last ember of arrogance flared in him, refusing to be smothered even under the crushing weight of the judge's words. He leaned forward, his hands gripping the polished mahogany table, his knuckles whitening as he forced out a bitter laugh. "You think you can destroy me?" he spat, his voice cracking but still laced with defiance. "Do you have any idea who I am? I have senators on speed dial, governors who owe me favors, men and women in power who wouldn't dare cross me. You wear that robe, judge, but when this trial ends, you'll see who holds the real authority." His words dripped venom, and for a moment, the courtroom fell into uneasy silence, the air thick with the tension of his threat. His lawyer tried to tug at his sleeve, whispering urgently for him to stop, but Harrington shook him off violently, eyes burning with desperate pride. "This little spectacle you're putting on for the press means nothing. I built empires from dust. I can crush anyone who stands in my way, and that includes you and your precious daughter." Gasps rippled through the gallery, reporters scribbled furiously, every sentence a headline waiting to detonate. The judge, however, did not flinch. Instead, he reached calmly beneath his bench and withdrew a thick folder bound with red string. Setting it heavily on the desk, he pushed it forward with deliberate care, the sound echoing like a drumbeat of inevitability. Mr. Harrington, the judge replied evenly, his voice like steel cloaked in calm, while you were busy weaving your web of arrogance and deceit, others were entangling it. This file contains bank records, testimonies, and photographs, evidence of bribes, offshore accounts, fraud, and more. Every senator you think is loyal to you will scatter when this evidence reaches the light. Every governor you name will deny you to save themselves. You see, power built on corruption collapses the moment it is exposed. Harrington's face paled, his bluster faltering as the folder sat before him like a loaded weapon. The judge leaned in slightly, his eyes narrowing with both personal rage and judicial clarity. You believed this was about my daughter. But this court will reveal the rot you've spread into every corner of this city. And when I am finished, not only will justice for Eleanor be delivered, you will have nothing left to corrupt. Not even your own name. The murmurs in the courtroom rose again, but this time, they were whispers of awe, not fear. For the first time, Harrington looked not like a king among men but a criminal cornered, his empire trembling beneath the weight of truth.